Bem-vindos a esta sexta e última sessão do Simpósio Internacional de Filosofia Antiga. E nessa sessão nós teremos dois palestrantes. Eu tenho a alegria de receber o professor Alessandro Stavru e também Celso Vieira e Maicon Engler. Alessandro Stavru, ele é um professor associado na Universidade de Verona. Ele é membro do Steering Committee, é um dos professores que tem atuado há muitos anos na sociedade, no grupo de pré-Socrates e, mais recentemente, na recém-fundada Sociedade de Estudos Socráticos. E organizou vários colóquios sobre Sócrates, editou também livros, né? E ele foi premiado em 2014 pelo Ministério Italiano da Universidade, pelo ministro, né, italiano, ligado à educação, com a qualificação científica para atuar como professor associado de História da Filosofia e Estética na Itália. Entre as suas publicações, Il potere della apparenza, percorso histórico crítico nella estética antiga, em 2011, Sócrates e la cureia della anima, Diálogo e Abertura ao Mundo, de 2009, e Sócrates, Mito et Ética della Conoscenza, Estudio sugli scritti socratico di Walter Friedrich Otto, 2006. O outro convidado é o professor Celso Vieira, que é um egresso aqui do Departamento de Filosofia, fez a pós-graduação com a professora Miriam e hoje é pesquisador na Universidade de Ruhr. Ele está pesquisando sob a orientação da professora Bárbara Sattler, na Universidade de Bochum, em Ruhr, né? Ele também pesquisou nos Vlastos Archive, do Harry Hanson Center da Universidade do Texas, financiado pela Under Mellon Foundation, e entre as suas publicações tem uma tradução do Crátilo, que foi objeto, né, da sua tese, em 2015, ele publicou, e artigos em revistas especializadas no exterior. E sua tradução do Alcibiades, né, está para ser publicada em 2022. E como moderador, o professor Maicon Engler, que é professor na Universidade Federal do Paraná, teve formação na Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina, mas também com estágio na Alemanha, em Marburg. E o professor Maicon também atualmente faz a sua licença sabática aqui na UFMG. Nós tivemos a oportunidade de ter um curso com ele sobre a República de Platão no semestre passado. E entre as suas publicações tem artigos como Gorgias e a Retoricidade, Onipresença e Onipotência da Capacidade Retórica, The Sophist Movement and the Frenzy of New Education. Então, é uma alegria ter um grupo, né, como este aqui nessa mesa, e eu passo, então, a palavra ao primeiro expositor, professor Alessandro. Alessandro Stavru, welcome to Brazil, even if only virtually, and I give you the floor to your lecture. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Cecilia, for this wonderful presentation, for these nice words, and actually, what I have in mind today is to present you a series of texts which tell you a different story about one of the main issues connected to Socrates, which is his supposed agraphy. That is the fact that Socrates did not write anything. We heard yesterday many times Socrates did not write anything. He chose not to do so. Probably he had good reasons not to do so. Important scholars claim that if Socrates wanted to write something, probably he would have done so. And actually what we know from 4th century authors, texts and literature is that Socrates did not write anything, opposed to Plato. But if we look at one text, which is Plato's Phaedo, a very specific text of Plato's Phaedo, we learn a different story. We learn that Socrates, in the very last days of his life, produced something. He wrote something, and what he wrote was a retelling of Aesop and a hymn to Apollo. This is what we learn at the end of the Phaedo. But this is an exception. The 4th century texts tell us, as I said, something different. What I would try to show is that if we look at the 5th century, that is mostly at comic playwrights, we find a different image of Socrates. We find a Socrates who is deeply involved with musicae, who has teachers in musicae, who has interests for specific poets, that is Stesichorus, as we will see. And of course, then we know that Esop is, of course, another important reference for Socrates. And we know, and this is maybe the most interesting of all facts, and this is attested by many playwrights, that Socrates was the ghostwriter of Euripides. So we learned that Euripides composed, of course, his own tragedies, but Socrates was behind him, more or less writing pieces, whole pieces of his works, or even everything of what we have from Euripides. And this is astonishing because we find this not only in Aristophanes, we find this in Teleuclides, we find this in Callias, we find this in Eupolis. So it's attested many times. It's a comic commonplace, this association between Socrates and Euripides. So there is I think this is a very interesting issue we should look at with great care. Socrates, in connection with these 3 poets, Stesichorus, Aesop, and Euripides. I will deal with the 3 of them and look at the evidence we have of these 3 connections of Socrates. What we learn from 5th century authors is, first of all, that Socrates had music teachers. So he was instructed in music, that musicae was not only music in the strict sense, it was also connected with versifying. So he was able to compose verses. These music teachers were very, very famous music teachers. One of them might be even Damon, who was close to Pericles, who belonged to the circle of Pericles. This is what we know from Diogenes Laertius. And then we have a whole play by Amipsias, a comic playwright, which was performed in 423, the same Dionysian aegon in which the clouds were performed. And actually, Amipsias performed better than Aristophanes because he came second at that aegon, while Aristophanes came third in with the clouds. So Socrates, and in that case, we know that the music teacher was Konos. So we know of 2 music teachers of Socrates, and this is already something we should look at with great care. Then we know that Socrates had great poetical abilities. He was able to sing even with the lyre, to sing Stesichorus, and this is what we will look at. There is a specific fragment we will look at. He was a personal friend of Euripides. He was a ghostwriter of Euripides. Then we know that he had the knowledge of Aesop's work, and he was able to reformulate Aesop in a poetic way by versifying Aesop. And then we know from Plato's Phaedo, as I said, that in the very last days of his life, he composed verses, and he composed a hymn to Apollo. And we have some hints, some pieces of these compositions attested by later authors, by Diogenes Laertius specifically. The first text I will look at is a fragment drawn from Eupolis, which goes back to a play rehearsed in 421, so shortly after Clouds. And here we hear something which was a commonplace in those years. Socrates, while receiving a wine cup from the right and playing Stesichorus to the lyre, stole the wine jug. So a Socrates who steals things, who sits at the symposium, and then from the right, he receives a wine cup, he sings, probably he plays a lyre, and he sings Stesichorus's verses. By doing so, he distracts his audience, and this is the joke of the whole verse, which we learn here. And by distracting his audience, he's able to steal something which is not small, a wine jug. It's not easy to steal a wine jug. So to do so, you must really be able to distract your audience. And Socrates as a thief is something which of course is very funny, but we know that Socrates is a thief if we look at the clouds of Aristophanes, which were rehearsed 423. Actually, we have a later version of that play, which is not the play of 423, but in several occasions in Clouds, Socrates steals things from his pupils, and he steals mostly the cloak, in some cases even the shoes, and he does so probably because he's very poor. This is the way he is represented in Clouds, and this is the way he's represented throughout Old Comedy, as a very poor teacher who probably is paid by his pupils, but he's not paid much, and therefore he's always poor, and he needs to steal things in order to make his school go on in a way, and to pay for everything he needs to pay for, because he has a school which is the Frontisterion, as we learn from Aristophanes' Clouds. So the Socrates of Old Comedy has this feature. He's connected to asceticism, to a series of ascetic practices, but as an ascetic, he's also quite poor, and therefore he needs to steal. And this is what we learn also from this play, from Eupolis, where his ability to steal is connected to another ability, which is the ability to sing and to know, of course, by heart, Stesichorus, as a rhapsode is able to do. So Socrates is presented here as a rhapsode, someone who is versed in poetry, who has poetical skills and knowledge. The next text, T2, is from a late author, from a Roman imperial author of the late 4th century AD, so very late. And here we see what happened to Socrates in the very last days of his life. Socrates condemned to death, thrown into prison, asks a musician who was playing Stesichorus to learn Stesichorus. He would like to learn in the very last days of his life these verses. And the answer of this musician is, what for? You're going to die in a few days. Why do you need to learn Stesichorus? What for? And the answer is of Socrates, in order that I might know something more before I depart from life. So in this case, Stesichorus plays a special role, a kind of preparation to death, kind of melete thanato, as we know from the Phaedo, which is done through poetry, which is done through Stesichorus again. So we find again Stesichorus, and again Stesichorus plays a very special role for Socrates. Text T3 is maybe the text every one of you knows, or most of you know. It is a passage from Phaedrus, where we have again Stesichorus playing a very important role. And here we learn that Stesichorus had composed a palinode to Helen. And as we read, this composition had a consequence for Stesichorus. Stesichorus got blind, and then he regained his sight, as we will see. I will read now the text. And so, my friend, this is Socrates speaking, I must purify myself. Now, for those whose offense lies in telling false stories about matters divine, there is an ancient rite of purification. Homer did not know it, but Stesichorus did. When he lost his sight for speaking ill of Helen, he did not, like Homer, remain in the dark about the reason why. On the contrary, true follower of the muses that he was, he understood it and immediately composed these lines. So these are the lines of Stesichorus, which are quoted by the Socrates of Plato. There's no truth to that story. You never sailed that lovely ship. You never reached the Tower of Troy. And as soon as he completed the poem, we call the palinode, he immediately regained his sight. So Stesichorus composed the palinode, and then he lost his blindness, contrary to Homer, who remained blind for the whole of his life. And now I will prove to be wiser than Homer and Stesichorus to this small extent. I will try to offer my palinode to love before I am punished for speaking ill of him, with my head bare, no longer covered in shame. So we have here a story, Helen, who did not go to Troy after all. This is, we know that there is a long tradition about this different account of Helen's story. We know that Euripides is, Helen is about a different, this story, Helen going to Egypt and not to Troy. In Troy, we have only a simulacra, a kind of phantom of Helen and not the true Helen. And Stesichorus sticks to that tradition. So the true Helen was not in Troy. This is what Stesichorus realizes at some point. And as soon as he realizes that, as soon as he sees the truth, he regains his sight. So the poet rehabilitates Helen, of course, because if Helen did not go to Troy, she's not responsible for the war of Troy. And by doing so, by rehabilitating Helen, the poet regains his sight. As a result of his retraction, he changed his mind. First, he accused Helen, then he changes his mind, and he regains the sight. In Plato, we have Socrates' Plato, we have a similar situation because Socrates has offended the god Eros, and he needs to expiate his guilt. So he presents Socrates, he presents himself as an inspired poet who is blinded, as we will see now in the next text, and who then eventually will regain his sight, will rehabilitate his view of Eros. This is the sense of what we read here. So Plato is appropriating Stesichorus, the theme of Stesichorus, the theme of the blindness, which goes back, of course, to Homer even, to reformulate it and to present philosophy as the true poetry, the poetry of truth. So as we see in text 4 of Phaedrus, here we see a Socrates who is blind, because Socrates is speaking to Phaedrus and he tells Phaedrus, where then is the boy to whom I was speaking? Let him hear this speech too, otherwise he may be too quick to give his favors to the non-lover. And Phaedrus answered, he is here, you can't see him, but he is here, right by your side, whenever you want him. So Socrates is blind in this passage, as the poet is blind, as Stesichorus was blind, as Socrates was blind. But by rehabilitating Eros, he will regain his sight as Stesichorus did. So we see here again the Stesichorus here, of course, in Plato's reformulation of the theme, and we see, of course, here an analogy between the text, these texts, and what we have seen before. Stesichorus as a blind poet, and Socrates who gets blinded, but who will then eventually regain his sight. Stesichorus is the true musicos. This is very important to note here in Plato's reuse of Stesichorus, contrary to Homer. Homer is not the pure poet. Homer is a poet who needs to be reformulated, to be rethought, to be even censored for big parts, as we know from the Republic and from many other passages. Stesichorus is the champion of a purified form of poetry, the champion of an ethicized form of poetry, where ethics plays a huge role and not only the traditional myths of tradition. So this is one of the main reasons why we have, probably why we have here Stesichorus as a champion of poetry, contrary to Homer, who needs to be rethought completely. So in this, this might be one of the reasons why Stesichorus plays a huge role for Socrates, much more than Homer and Hesiod, as we will as you can't see here, but as we can see from many other passages. So again, philosophy is presented here as the primal musicae, the primal form of music, the original form of music, which is able to tell through beauty the truth, and not that form of art which is concealing truth through beauty, which is the traditional Homeric poetry. I move now on to the passage of Phaedrus, I was talking about before, which is the passage in which we have the retelling of Aesop's verses. We can go a bit further, so I can maybe read parts of that. Yes, and here we have Socrates telling Cebes and talking to Cebes, to the Pythagorean Cebes, and Evenus, the poet, Evenus, poet and philosopher of the 5th century, asked Socrates the day before he went to prison, what had induced him to write poetry after he came to prison, putting the fables of Aesop into verse and composing a hymn to Apollo. We will now see this hymn and those verses in later traditions. Socrates refers to a dream he had, and this dream prompted him to write those verses and to compose this hymn. The dream was something like this. It was a dream that often came to Socrates. And this dream told to Socrates, Socrates, practice and cultivate the arts. And Socrates now understands in the very last days of his life that this dream should be taken literally, because in the past, this is what Socrates says here, I imagined that this dream was instructing and advising me to do what I was doing, such as those who encourage runners in a race, that the dream was thus bidding me to do the very thing I was actually doing, namely to practice the art of philosophy, this being the highest kind of art. And I was doing that. So Socrates misunderstood the dream, and he understood that the dream was telling him to practice philosophy, so to practice exactly what he was doing. But now, in the very last days of his life, he understands that the dream the dream should be taken seriously. It might mean something different. And so Socrates says, I first wrote in honor of the god of the present festival, of Apollo. After that, I realized that a poet, if he is to be a poet, must compose fables, not arguments. Being no teller of fables myself, I took the stories I knew and had at hand, the fables of Aesop. And I versified the first ones I came across. So Socrates suddenly realizes I did not get what the dream was telling me. I need to do something different. I need to versify the fables I know, those of Aesop, and then to compose a hymn to the god Apollon. We know that the Phaedo has a very special relationship to Apollon. We know that the end of the Phaedo has to do again with Apollon. So Apollon plays a huge role here in this dialogue. But what is important here is that Socrates has this ability, because you cannot improvise verse tellings. Versification needs, of course, skills, which Socrates has. So it is very probable that this Socrates is the Socrates who is learned in musicae, who has a music ability, which is very important, I mean, which enables him to do what he wants to do. So I will now move on to the next passage, which is the passage I told you before, this is Diogenes Laertius 242, where we have those verses, those things Socrates put to paper. Socrates was put in prison, and a few days afterwards drank the hemlock, after much noble discourse, which Plato records in the Phaedo. Further, according to some, he composed a paean to Apollo, beginning, "All hail Apollo, Delos Lord, hail Artemis, ye noble pair." He also composed a fable of Aesop, not very skillfully, beginning, "Judge not, ye men of Corinth," Aesop cried, "of virtue as the jury courts decide." So we have even here small bits of what Socrates wrote. And Athenaeus reports also some verses of Socrates in the De Sophists. Socrates in his poems, so Socrates wrote poems according to Diogenes and Athenaeus. And in his poems, Socrates says that those men who dance best are best in warlike exploits, and thus he writes, "But they who in the dance most suitably do honor to the gods are likewise best in the deeds of war." This is a theme we have in the laws, in Plato's laws. We have this association between dancing and warfare. If you are a good dancer, you're good at war as well. So this is a theme which Plato develops at length in laws. Let me now move on to the last big poet which is connected to Socrates, which is Euripides, where we have actually large evidence about an association and a very early evidence. But I will start with a late text, which is Claudius Aelianus, who reports how this relationship was, this relationship between Socrates and Euripides. Socrates went rarely to the theater, we get to know, unless when Euripides, the tragic poet, contested with new tragedians. So Socrates did not love to go to theater, except that he went there when his friend Euripides was competing in important contests. Only then he used to go. And when Euripides was competing in the Piraeus, he went down there, for he loved the man for his wisdom, as well as for the excellence of his verses. So very important, again, we have here Socrates, who is associated with Socrates, with Euripides, not only for the Sophia, but also for tois metrois areten, for the virtue he has in versifying. So again, we have here Socrates, who is very skillful, who is very competent in versifying, in composing poetry, not only in the Sophia, in the meaning of poetry, but also in how poetry is concretely done, technically performed, and technically composed. And then I move on to the next series of texts, which are all of playwrights. And the earliest playwrights reporting about Socrates are the earliest playwright referring to Socrates is very probably Teleuclides, who was active in the 40s and 30s of the 5th century, so quite early, much before Aristophanes began his career. I mean, years before Aristophanes began his career. And Teleuclides, again, is insisting on this association between Socrates and Euripides. The first fragment goes like this. It was thought that Socrates helped Euripides to make his place. Hence, Mnesicolus, who was the father-in-law of Euripides, writes that there comes a new play by Euripides, The Friars, in which Socrates provides the wood for frying. So Socrates, who cooks, or to put it literally, fries the plays of Euripides. So Euripides comfortably sits on a sofa, and Socrates is cooking for him and preparing the wonderful meal, which are of course the tragedies by Euripides. So this is a way of saying in a very clear way, Socrates is the ghostwriter of Euripides. Next fragment is fragment text 10. Euripides your plays are built of Socratic rods. So the structure, the very structure, the essence, one could say, of Euripides' plays is built up by Socrates. Socrates is providing the solidity, one could say, the skeleton of everything Euripides does. So again, here, this statement is a very clear statement about how much Euripides depends on Socrates, according to Teleuclides. And then we have Callias, who in 431, so even here we have a date which is earlier, years earlier than Clouds, where we have two characters who are interacting, and the first character is saying, "Why are you so haughty, and why are your thoughts so deep?" And the other character says, "Because I can afford it." Socrates is the author. The second character is very likely Euripides. So Euripides can afford to be Semnos. We know that Semnotes is a characteristic of Socrates in Clouds. Very often we have this Semnotes of Socrates. And then we have this phronein, and phronein again is a feature of Socrates in Clouds. The Frontisterion is the place where people practice this phronein. Haughtiness and thinking, deep thinking, is something Euripides is able to perform, to do in his plays, to show in his plays, because Socrates is the author of them. Socrates is the one who composed them. So we have here three texts which say more or less the same. Socrates is the spiritus rector, one could say, the true author of Euripides' plays. Then we have a fragment from Clouds 1. This is one of the very rare cases where we have a text which comes down to us as a text going back to the first version of Clouds, which was rehearsed in 423. The version we have of Clouds is later, maybe after 420 it was composed, maybe in more stages. And here we hear that this is the one who composes tragedies for Euripides, this Socrates, those plays full of chatter, but also of wisdom. So here's the one who composes Euripides. Don't look at Euripides, it's Socrates, the author. And then text T13 is a passage from the end, more or less, of Frogs. And again, here we have a very clear picture, which is provided here by Aristophanes in 404, so at the end of the 5th century. So we have now come more or less to the end of this evidence, which is the 5th century evidence about Socrates as a poet. And here we have the chorus, which is reproaching Euripides, and through these words: "So to be truly civilized, don't sit by Socrates and chat, or cast the muse's work aside, forgetting the most vital skills of writing tragedies." So don't do that. Don't sit by Socrates to write tragedies. Do something else. Go with someone else. Don't associate with Socrates if you want to write the true tragedies, if you want to stick to the muses. Wasting time with pompous words, this is what you're doing, Euripides, while idly scratching verbal bits that suits a man who has lost his wits. So this is a very harsh reproach toward Euripides. We know this is the if we want to see what the context is, the context of this reproach is, of course, the agon between Euripides and Aeschylus. We know that at the end of this agon, Dionysus will choose not Euripides as he wanted to at the beginning of the play of the Frogs, to take back. He doesn't want to take back from hell Euripides. He will take back Aeschylus. He will change his mind after seeing that Aeschylus is the better poet, much better than Euripides. So, and one reason for this is that Euripides is associated with Socrates and allowed Socrates to write his tragedies, and the true spiritus rector of Euripides is is Socrates. And this is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but this is toward the end of the Agon. So Dionysius is quite close here to the decision he will make to reject Euripides in favor of Aeschylus. And it is very likely that this association with Socrates plays an important role in Dionysius' final decision to prefer Euripides. So this is the last text I wanted to show you. I hope I made clear how Socrates, the 5th century Socrates mostly, has strong links with poets, composed poetry himself, was active as a poet in the last days of his life, very likely, but probably Socrates had this ability through his whole life, and he probably used this ability to influence Euripides, to have a strong influence on Euripides. He was able even to sing, he had musical abilities. And this picture, I think, is very different from the picture we know from the 4th century authors, from Plato, Xenophon, and from the Socratics. And I think, therefore, quite valuable and to be taken very seriously, because the evidence, as we see, is not isolated. We have many authors, different authors, who tell us more or less very similar things. And this might be, I'm very eager to look to the, for the discussion, and looking forward to your comments, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Alessandro, for this collection of excerpts in favor of your team. It's very interesting, and I'm sure that will be a lot of comments. I'm going now to pass to give the floor to Celso Vieira, and after his presentation, then you have the discussion and the comments by Maicon. Please, Celso.
Obrigado, Cecília. Bom, queria começar agradecendo, né, o convite. É um prazer estar aqui, rever tantas caras amigas, e é claro que dá uma certa saudade e vontade de que pudesse ser presencial, né, para a gente aproveitar a melhor parte dessas ocasiões, mas vai do jeito que é possível dessa vez, né? Bom, eu vou compartilhar o texto para vocês lerem junto, compartilharem a tela. Quero saber primeiro se está do tamanho, se vocês estão vendo, e se está no tamanho que dá para vocês lerem comigo.
Está ótimo.
Está ótimo? Tudo bem, então. Então, vou começar para a leitura, porque para a gente não atrasar muito o cronograma. The Western common sense notion of self remains deeply indebted to the modern reflection. Gill suggests characterizing the latter based on two features, individuality and subjectivity. The degree of individuality and subjectivity is unprecedented. In the other cultures and epochs, individuals are seen and defined in terms of their participations in a community. A more objective approach to their experience also follows. The epistemic attitude following the strong subjectivity in the modern epoch is equally powerful. What came to be known as the first-person perspective is defined by three main features. They derive from a Cartesian approach. Authority, each person is the sole arbiter of the contents of their mental internal states. Transparency, the access to these contents is clear to each individual. And groundlessness, the access does not depend on the application of any cognitive method. In this model, if this model is to be followed, acquiring self-knowledge is just a matter of introspecting into oneself. A common critique is that it can only account for trivial internal states, such as being hungry. Nevertheless, its background still appears in many contemporary reflections. Now, for the authentic self. The authentic self appears as a reaction to the limitations of the previous model. The reaction, however, was not strong enough to break the general framework of individuality and subjectivity. As such, it remains a modern notion. As the critique goes, the subjective introspection can reveal that the content of our internal states is not that transparent to ourselves. If so, there is an opaque side of the self, the unconscious, to use the Freudian term. If so, knowledge of the self will not be complete without discovering its contents. Moreover, even the internal states that we do recognize may not be really ours. After all, it is easy to reckon that they are deeply embedded in cultural values and rational methods. Since individuality still is more valued than participation, adding both critiques turns self-knowledge into a quest to find one's way into their internal states without the influence and mediation of these external factors. If so, groundless and authority cease to be facts. However, they stay as desiderata. Each individual remains as the sole arbiter of its own internal states. The problem is that they currently access it with the interference of cultural norms and rational methods of a given society. So there are a lot of parts that I had to cut off to fit the time, unfortunately. I hope you can try to read it while I go along, but yeah, I'll have to do. Self-knowledge becomes a process of transformation of the self based on the liberation from external constraints. Some examples following this line are self-creation, self-realization, self-care, or self-fashioning. One central question is how one can measure the success of self-knowledge. The views are nuanced, but in general, there is the recognition that one of the goals is aiming at an internal unity. I believe that this attitude implies the background operation of some sort of coherency. In a coherentist theory of truth, information is justified in virtue of how much and how strong are its relations to the other information in the set. Self-knowledge becomes a process of finding internal harmony or unity. However, one must be careful not to trespass their aim of keeping free of rational methods. Thus, I suggest characterizing these views as supposing an aesthetic coherentism in which the harmony is based on a subjectively developed judgment akin to what we may call matters of taste. Then I pass to the contemporary reactions to the modern view. Many researchers claim that because the ancient do not share a modern background, their approach comes closer to the contemporary one. Thus, it will be useful to characterize the latter, the objective self. There was a contemporary reaction to the subjective authority and transparency of the self in modern times. Cashing on what the modern critique already showed, it's not clear that we have transparent access to our internal states, and even when we feel we have, it's not clear that we are right in doing so. The authority of the first person is abandoned, but rationality remains. The knowledge of the self follows the state-of-the-art methods of knowledge to the knowledge of the others. This objective and or outside view came to be known as the third-person perspective. Following the behaviorist trends, the actions which are objective should provide the information for making inferences and reaching conclusions about the self. The social self. In spite of the value of objectivity, the effects of subjectivism did not vanish. For sure, extreme individualism is not endorsed anymore. The recognition of the social aspect of cognition based on personal relations led to the so-called intersubjective turn. Individuals need others to become what they are, and more importantly, it depends on the personal character of these relations between different subjectivities. The second person perspective arises. Instead of a third person experiences, we are formed and informed about ourselves through second person involvement. Now finally to the ancient view. Throughout all the reflections of the modern and contemporary approach, the ancient Greek tradition is repeatedly brought into the discussion either to emphasize common points or to serve as a contrast. For instance, the absence of a strong notion of subjective self is said to lead to a more objective treatment. This would bring them closer to the contemporary third-person approach. On the other hand, Their focus on rationality was criticized by the first proponents of the authentic self. Yet, the conception of self-care arising from this tradition is traced back to the ancients, even if in a way that may be too rationalistic and impersonal to allow for personal care. For all these aspects, Plato's Alcibiades appears as a central reference. In the following, I want to explore the dialogue to examine the notion of self, a second-person perspective, and a coherentist version of the self-transformation, so that this previous prologue will hopefully make sense. Auto to auto. In Alcibiades, we find an awkward expression auto to auto and some variations. The awkwardness comes from its fractal structure. As Prado analyzes, Plato picks the reflexive pronoun auto and uses it as a substantive. After that, he adds the same word as a reflexive pronoun to itself. We have all the ingredients for a translator's nightmare. The attempts to translate while making sense vary. To list a few, they are there. I'm not going to read it as well. The language is reminiscent of Plato's theory of ideas, which does not play an explicit role in the dialogue. The passage occurs in the context of Socrates discussing how we should take care, of ourselves. To do so, he claims that we must know what we ourselves are. And then, looking for an object for this sort of knowledge, he suggests the auto to auto, the itself in itself, which he later contrasts to the auto hekaston, the itself in oneself. Because of this substantivation of the pronoun, some commentators find it legitimate to translate it by self or soi. They are careful enough to mention that by doing so, they are not presupposing a Cartesian view, but they defend their option by saying that there is a step towards an individualization of the self. Another trend is to take the second auto not as a reflexive, but as in an intensive sense. Plato is trying to call into attention what a human being essentially is, namely the soul in opposition to body or possessions, as discussed in the preceding and proceeding passages. As anyone who distinguishes the previous scholarly trends into, I will take the path of a compromise. I believe that the main goal is to focus the discussion on the soul, thus intensive. Nevertheless, we can only understand that in relation to the problem of reflexivity applied to self-knowledge treated elsewhere. In the Charmides, Plato presents Socrates dismissing the utility of self-knowledge. The main argument concerns two features that knowledge must have. Knowledge requires an object. Knowledge must be of something. For instance, medicine is the knowledge of health. That is to say, knowledge is transitive. If so, self-knowledge must have an object. Since there is no notion of a self to be the object of knowledge, Socrates develops the hypothesis that self-knowledge is the knowledge of itself, that is, knowledge of knowledge, thereby a reflexive relation. However, he finds a metaphysical problem. A transitive relation that requires an object cannot have itself as an object. He offers an argument by analogy. Being big is a transitive relation. For something to be big, it must be bigger than something. If something is to be big by being bigger than itself, it will be, at the same time, bigger and smaller than itself, which makes no sense. The same applies to knowledge that must be of something, transitive, and therefore it cannot be of itself, reflexive. Therefore, self-knowledge is not possible. Now we can go back to the Alcibiades. Preceding our passage, Socrates declares, citation, well, then, could we ever know what art makes the man himself better if we are ignorant of what we are ourselves? Socrates is postponing the investigation about the knowledge and positing an object other than the knowledge itself as their goal. The aporia in the Charmides seems to be presupposed in this move. In the ensuing discussion, he stresses that we are our souls, finding thus an object for self-knowledge. The reader might still not know what the art science is that will make us better, but we know, at least, what must become better. It is also important to remark that in the sequence of the discussion concerning the soul, Socrates admits that they have failed to investigate this object purely or in itself. What they have investigated was the autohekaston, the itself in oneself, that is to say, the embodied individual occurrence of a soul. Thus, Plato's Alcibiades thus seems to constitute a relevant step towards an individuated version of the self constructed as a center of desires and mainly decision-making. However, the source of the step has nothing to do with personal experience or introspection, but rather with a problem of reflexivity in self-knowledge. Accordingly, the way Plato develops the latter reflection about the soul does not explore introspection subjectivity. This will be important to examine in the next focal point, the second person perspective of the investigation and care of oneself, a dialogue between souls. Knowledge of itself as taking care of itself is introduced since the beginning of the Alcibiades. Translated in this way, it might strike us as somewhat similar to the so-called ethics of care, in which the effective second person perspective has a central role. In this view, there is a personal affective connection between individuals, grounding the relation of moral responsibility between them. Such a notion is certainly indebted to a post-Christian worldview in which compassion or connected affection is a central moral virtue. This applies to the Western world, but not to the classic period Athens. Epimeleomai, take care, in the most common translation, does not have this sense of care, compassion. I believe it does not have the stark sense of Lamb's translation as take pains. I am happy to accept the most common use as to manage, to occupy oneself, or more detailedly, to bring about a planned result through engaged management. That said, after we control for this compassionate tendency in the interpretation of care, I want to argue that the second person still plays a central role in the process of self-knowledge developed in the Alcibiades. Socrates describes their discussions as citation, and it is proper to take the view that you and I are conversing with each other while we make use of words by intercourse of soul with soul. Accordingly, Socrates says that Alcibiades needs him to achieve his objective, and that whatever Alcibiades is in need, Socrates also needs. It seems clear that the process of thinking together, which is part of taking care of oneself, can only be achieved through the connection of two, maybe more, souls. During the discussion, their individual beliefs should come together, leading to a further inferential conclusions that would not be possible alone. In the sequence, Socrates presents the analogy of the mirror to clarify his take on self-knowledge. It is, again, an argument by analogy. The source analogy is, vision is not self-reflexive. So the negative analogy is the eye has to look at a reflexive object to see itself while seeing. And there is the condition also, addition that ideally the reflector will be another eye. The target side of the analogy is worth quoting. And if the soul too, my dear Alcibiades, is to know herself, she must surely look at a soul, and especially at a region of it in which occurs the virtue of a soul, wisdom, and at any other part of the soul which resembles this. Here is a proposed reconstruction. So, of course, I'm going to read only the target side of the analogy. Knowledge is not self-reflexive. The soul has to think a thinking object to think itself while thinking, and ideally the rational part of another soul. This would be the rational part of another soul. Yeah, there's a lot of details and tensions in these reconstructions, but yeah, I put it in a note and maybe we discuss it in the discussion. There is a discussion if the analogy wants to emphasize the irreflexivity of the soul's activity or the region where its virtuous activity occur. They are not exclusive, but the focuses lead to different interpretative conclusions. Among those who deny the reflexivity of the soul, the more extreme version holds that one cannot examine one's own beliefs. As Wolff argues, the reason is that for such an examination to occur, one would have to doubt their own belief. Since it is impossible to hold and not hold one belief at the same time, self-examination does not occur. Further evidence for this claim would be the fact that Socrates seldom examines his own beliefs. Against that, those who defend the possibility of self-examination point out to the conception of thinking as a dialogue with oneself. Lead is an example. In this case, there is no irreflexivity. The soul can think itself thinking and, while doing so, be critical towards its own asserted beliefs. There is a quotation here of Theaetetus to illustrate the dialogue with oneself that I am not going to read. First of all, it must be noticed that both accounts rightly point out that the examinations in question are not about the souls themselves, but about the contents of the soul. This content-centered approach is in line with the view in the Charmides that knowledge is transitive. It must be of an object. What is assumed in the reflexive position such as Wolff's is that an investigation about beliefs can only be possible from an outside view, a third-person perspective. Lee defends an alternative interpretation. She calls a first-person plural epistemic authority, according to which one can entertain different positions and be self-critical towards them. But it is safer when this position is then tested in a discussion with others. Both accounts fit what happens in the Socratic elenchus, seen as a process of examination of beliefs, as we are about to see in more detail. However, I believe that they miss one important aspect connected to the participative, in opposition to the individual, consideration of humans among the ancient Greeks. An operative, if neglected aspect of the Socratic elenchus is that it consists of a public performance. This setting up plays the role of nudging the interlocutor to assert only what they are willing to hold in the public sphere, that is to say, to be known and held responsible for having a given belief. This is most clear in the Gorgias, in which Gorgias and Callicles concede the victory to Socrates' arguments because they are ashamed of holding the belief that would be necessary for them to defend their positions. Thus, we arrive at a non-subjective, non-compassion-based alternative to the use of the second person. Coherentism. Yeah, there's a lot of remarks about more, I don't know, enthusiastic ways of acquiring knowledge that we find in the dialogues, but I will not treat that here now and jump to the rational part. It is clear that rational methods remain the driving force underlying the Socratic elenchus. These methods can be said to have objectivity as a goal, but to do so, they do not rely on empirical evidence. As such, it is important not to conflate them with contemporary objectivity as suggested by Gill and others. Providing that the situation is mixed, like in the authentic self, the aim of the process is a unitary internal stage through the abandonment of non-justified beliefs. Once again, a coherent theory of truth appears to be assumed. To see how, we need to dig deeper into the elenchus. In the Alcibiades, taking care of oneself is the process of becoming better. And do you call it proper pains or care when someone makes a thing better? This is a question by Socrates. The action to become better through knowledge occurs in the embodied soul, so the auto-ekaston. However, the object of such a knowledge is not reflexive. The soul will not become better by thinking itself, nor by reflecting about its own beliefs, as we saw in the revised second-person perspective. A better soul depends on better beliefs, and beliefs are good in virtue of being proved concerning what they are about. The transitivity of knowledge is still valid. The interlocutors are not looking for their beliefs about justice, but rather by justice itself. This is the sense of objectivity that depends on a collective, rational, and public examination. This joint examination in the Socratic dialogues is the elenchus or cross-examination. Kamtekar puts it thus. So the phases of cross-examination. Socrates asks the interlocutor a question, the interlocutor replies with some belief that P. Socrates elicits from the interlocutor further assertions and then shows that they entail not P. Socrates then asks the examinee which of P or other assertions he wishes to revive, or tells him that P has been proved false, or that, contrary to his avowal that P, that he has been shown not to believe that P. So you can show someone what they do not believe, which of course assumes that there is no first-person authority about their own beliefs. In the Gorgias, he goes as far as claiming that Callicles disagrees with himself. Moreover, it is commonly accepted that through this process, the interlocutors become aware of their ignorance. In the Alcibiades, the young man ends up admitting that contrary to his initial beliefs, he does not know the matters of justice. Moreover, as Lee argues, the process also makes the interlocutors aware of the relevant pre-existing but unconscious beliefs concerning the topic of the investigation. Alcibiades, for instance, already had beliefs needed to the inference that, contrary to what he supposed, being just is also advantageous. Once again, it is important to notice the importance of the cross-examination being a public performance. Consider the discussion. Socrates says, well then, on which sort are you going to advise the Athenians to make war? Those who are acting unjustly, or those who are doing what is just? And then Alcibiades says, that is a hard question, for even if someone decides that he must go to war with those who are doing what is just, he would not admit that they were doing so, not publicly, of course. Alcibiades believes that there are private reasons to wage unjust wars based on the advantage for the stronger. But at least according to Socrates, his beliefs only occurs because he had not pursued the implications of what he already thought about justice. After the cross-examination, then Alcibiades at least should abandon such false beliefs. The beliefs are unjustified because they do not fit other more fundamental beliefs. We have then a coherentist model of, if not knowledge, at least belief justification. Once we look from the point of view of self-knowledge, the elenchus gains a positive result that most commentators miss. By eliminating contradictory beliefs, a particular soul will become less incoherent. Thus, one can see the process of self-knowledge through the application of a rational method in a public setting, generating a more unitary or harmonic soul. This is, or could be, happiness as an examined life. Its distinctive trait, it's being a piecemeal process, since it proceeds through one by one elimination of beliefs. System versus minimal fragmentation. We will not have time to dwell on details, but to conclude, I want to compare this model for a less incoherent soul with the other Platonic model arising from the study of the human soul. One of the most common introspective experiences that leads us for the search of self-knowledge as self-transformation is the recognition, or maybe the feeling, that there is some internal tension in us. Gala calls a type of this tension the aspiration torture, characterized as a state in which we have a rough estimate of of what we should be, but we also know that we fall short of it. However, since not all internal tensions are aspirational, the fragmented self may serve as a more general term. In the Phaedrus and Republic, the fragmentary self is explained in view of a partitioned system. In this case, a part of the soul believes that P, for instance, that war is only justified against unjust opponents. Another part believes or desires that not P, an unjust war that brings profit might be justified. And yet another part reinforces P and gets angry against the whole when it acts following not P. Given this structure, the harmony of the soul refers to the relation between the parts and not to the beliefs that inhabit them. Such harmony is then defined based upon the ideal hierarchy in which the reason, aided by the willingness, dominates the appetites. Self-knowledge or self-care to become a better person consists in establishing the rule of the reason, the part of the systems that believe that P in the example above. Let us call this a system fragmentation of the self. In the passages, dialogues in which there is no study of the human soul, we do not find such a system or any system. Instead, as in the piecemeal discussion described above, what we find is some sort of a minimal fragmentation. In this model, at each circumstance, a person that holds contradictory internal states, including beliefs, desires, intentions, emotions, and similar, can act following one or some of these stimuli. Some of them might correspond to P, others do not P. If we want an image, I suggest that we use or adapt the model of the aviary in the Theaetetus. In this model, the soul is like an aviary.
Celso, eu posso só te pedir por causa do horário para talvez, não sei quanto tempo que você tem ainda quanto você tem para ler, mas e sintetizar um pouco pelo tempo da discussão. Que já passou
é o último parágrafo.
Tá.
In this model, the soul is like an aviary and each internal state is a bird. Before an action, the soul catches one or more birds and acts according to them. Socrates even alludes to the fact that some birds fly in flocks, which can explain the chain of behaviors or feelings after one of them becomes salient. We also catch a bird while evaluating a previous action. More importantly, a lot of these birds are in tension with another. The more contradictory beliefs, the more contradictory behaviors and judgments will occur. Thus, self-knowledge by elimination of contradictory internal states will make someone better by reducing the chances of a contradictory behavior. If we think practically, it is much harder and more effortful to change yourself based on a piecemeal minimal fragmentation. Thus, at first, one could argue that the passionate soul offers a more useful description. And indeed, this would be the case, except that it does not fit reality. Our mental states and actions are too mixed and inconstant, influenced by a variety of factors such as mood, situation, habit, and so on. The fragmentation of the self is too chaotic to fit neatly in a system without incurring in a misleading simplification. The best alternative, at least according to the birds that occupy my mind right now, seems to be to accept the hard task of diminishing the internal contradictions through piecemeal self-examination. Yeah, thank you for the patience, and I'm sorry for...
Obrigada, a interrupção. Mas, em função do tempo, eu passo, então, obrigada pelo paper, eu passo, então, para o Maicon fazer os comentários e depois a gente passa para as questões. Maicon?
Okay. Thank you, Cecilia. First of all, thank you, Cecilia, for the invitation for this panel, for this symposium at all. It has been very nice to follow to attend to all these lectures. And the first thing I would like to say is that I could not agree more with both lectures, which I found very wonderful. But I still can formulate one or two questions. So I will first talk about the talk by Professor Alessandro, and then afterwards about Celsus. So Alessandro basically showed that in the 5th century, we have these testimonies to prove that Socrates was a kind of poet. And I was delighted by them because I always thought that in the 4th century, especially with Plato, we also have this. And then I would like to see what you think about this. Because, for example, Plato says in the Republic, Socrates says explicitly that he's not a poet in the Republic. But then afterwards, when he begins to educate the guardians, he says that he will do that mythologuntes, that he will tell a myth about the education of the guardians. And then also in the Phaedrus, for example, where he says that poetic madness, this kind of divine madness that he describes there, that poets must be, in a certain sense, mad. He also describes himself as being rapt, as being taken by the muses. And when he begins to tell us about the noetos topos, he says, no one has ever sung this topos, this place. No poet has ever sung this place. That means Socrates, or Plato, is the first one to sing about this place. This is the way I see this passage, for example. And also in the Ion, for example, when Ion says that he falls asleep every time he has to listen to a poet that's not Homer. But when he listens to Socrates, he does not fall asleep, but he gets more excited, more enthusiastic. I take this passage to be Plato's attempt to show that Socrates was able to behave as a poet, that he was as good as a poet, maybe as good as Homer. And then also the passage that you quote from the Phaedo, where Socrates says that he was not able to compose a myth. That's why he was only able to make logoi, but not mythoi. And that's why he decided to metrify Esop. But well, at the end of the Phaedo, he composes a myth, or Plato does, I don't know. And also at the beginning of the Phaedo, when he takes off the chains, he says, oh, I heard about this myth, and then tells this myth about the chains and pleasure and pain, proving that he can be a poet as good as Aesop or Homer, I don't know. And also this passage is very important because this is another piece of autobiographical information about Socrates, I would say. People normally take the Phaedo, the Phaedo to be a place where Plato describes Socrates' biography, especially when Socrates speaks about the pre-Socratics. But we also have this report at the beginning where Socrates says that everything he was doing before the Phaedo, and I would say every dialogue that comes before the Phaedo, was a sort of poetry. He was doing poetry in all dialogues that came before the Phaedo. So my question is, and also at the end, we could say that maybe the Symposium, at the end of Symposium, when Socrates is discussing with Agathon and Aristophanes about the possibility, about the existence of a poet that would be able to write both tragedy and comedy. And both the tragedian and the comedian, they say, no, this is impossible. This is impossible. No one can do that. But Plato, in a certain sense, has done that in the Symposium. It seems to me, at least, that Symposium has all these laughable elements and also these tragical elements. So it's hard to differentiate Plato from Socrates. I praise the attempt, Professor Rossetti and others who try to do that. For me, the real Socrates is Plato's Socrates. But anyway, it seems to me that Plato is trying to present Socrates as a poet. And then we would have also some testimonies in the 4th century to prove your thesis. Or if you can, if I can do that, say that in another way, maybe Plato bases his conception of Socrates on these 5th century testimonies that you quote, or he was aware of them and he was trying to develop them. Because it seems well, for me, beyond doubt that he's trying to present Socrates as a sort of poet. So this is the first comment on Stavru's paper, and then now I will comment a little bit on Celso's. So Celso is addressing a question that can be, how can I say, seen from a broad perspective, well, a broader perspective. There is this discussion, which you basically quote at the beginning of your paper, about modernity and self, and modernity and subjectum, to use the Cartesian word. And many great philosophers, such as Heidegger, for example, José Ortega y Gasset, Hannah Arendt, in a certain sense, Hegel and Nietzsche, Kierkegaard for sure, they would say that we have a difference in modernity, which consists basically on the subjectum, that we have now a subject which cannot be compared to what ancient philosophers call the subject, the autor, or any word that they use, the ego. So they use that to draw a difference between modernity and antiquity. And this implies, for example, the difference between dubitatio as the Grundstimmung of modern philosophy, the doubt, and Fauma as the Grundstimmung of ancient philosophy. As Heidegger puts, for example, in that text, Die Zeit des Weltbildes. There, for example, he interprets Protagoras' Homo Mensura fragment and says that the subject addressed there is not the modern subject, which goes against Hegel's opinion in his lecture on Protagoras. But anyway, this idea that the Greeks cannot conceive the Unendlichkeit der Subjektivität, the infinity of subjectivity, which is also at stake in Kierkegaard, and which is addressed also by in a book by Rodolfo Mondolfo, Il Soggetto Umano nella Cultura Antica, from 55, where he criticized Hegel, and he criticized this idea, showing that we can find some kind of subjectivism in antiquity. So I think that your paper is in this place, like discussing all these subjects. But I have a specific question about what you call the coherentism. I found that very nice to describe some of elements of the Socratic elenchus as coherentism, because one of the words that always draws my attention when I read, for example, the Alcibiades, but which I can also find in the Phaedrus and also in the Sophists, is the word homonoia, which is used to describe this internal coherence. So I only would like to see what you have to say about this word homonoia. I normally take this word to be the opposite of the word plane, which Socrates uses also in the Alcibiades, uses in the Phaedrus, and uses in the Sophists to describe rhetoric and also the discussion of universal themes such as justice or the ideas or so on. He says, when we have to discuss what iron is or what a rock is, our soul does not err. But when we have to discuss what justice and what beautiful is, then our soul begins to err, to wander. So it seems to me that this word is fundamental for your project. So those are the questions. I thank you again for those beautiful papers, and I hope I can contribute to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maicon, for these perspicuous comments. I will give the word to Alessandro and Celso, and there is also Constant, Silvana, and a question by Rogério. Then first of all, let's answer this question, and then I will give the floor to Constant and Silvana. But first, Celso, you could answer also Rogério, please.
Should I go first? Should
yes.
I?
Yeah,
yes,
please.
Maicon.
Yes.
So thank you, Maicon, very much for these observations. Of course, Plato is a great poet. This is what I was not the subject of this paper, but of course I could give another paper on Plato as a poet, which would be much easier than Socrates as a poet. So of course, Plato presents philosophy, I mean, his own philosophy as the sublime form of poetry. And I agree with you that the end of the symposium is very clear about that. It is even the synthesis of comedy and tragedy. So you have even everything more or less, and more or less epic as well. So you have everything compacted in one form, which is the Platonic dialogue, which is the true form of poetry. So those passages you see, you mentioned are of course very important. I wrote down everything, so thank you very much. I will look them up. But my impression is that whenever Plato puts poetry in mouth of Socrates, he means his own kind of poetry, which is the true philosophy. And only one case in Phaedo, in the passage I discussed, he mentions versifying. He mentions the technical aspect of poetry, which is not just mythologein, which if you take mythologein for telling Plato's myths, you have, of course, Plato's philosophy, because what is the myth of the cave? It's mythologein. So it's a kind of poetry, but it's the philosophical poetry Plato does. So one thing is Plato's philosophical poetry, and one thing is Socrates as a poet, Socrates as a skillful poet who knows how to versify, who knows the technical tools of poetry, who is even able to write the tragedies of Euripides. This, I think, is something different, which you have only in the Phaedo passage, and you don't have in those other passages where you have, I think, Plato's view of poetry, which is the true philosophy, which is the view of the end of the symposium. So this would be my answer. Maybe I'm wrong. I have to look up those passages, but this is what I would answer immediately. So thank you very much, Maicon.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael, for a very good and careful reading and very, very important points that, yeah, I guess it will allow me to discuss a little further. So yeah, you were absolutely right. There is this question that probably there's no subject as subjectivity in the modern times, because it was something that was so explored that it's unheard of, not only in relation to the Greeks, but in relation to any other culture. Most of the commentators, I guess, following probably Kant, they put the notion, so they try to trace back some important points in the construction of this such a peculiar notion of subjectivity, and they put they follow Kant, and they put the notion of fantasia in the Stoics that seems to be more individual subjectivity, so seeing the soul as a unique entity that has unique perceptions. And before that, we see some sorts of introspections, but they are not in the sense of being an individual and so unique as we see in the modern times. And it's really interesting, but unfortunately, I guess you read it, but I didn't have the opportunity to read, because when we read this romance from following the modern times, in which there is this really focus on the a flow of conscience of a really individual self that has a unique way to see, to experience the world. So it's something that we do not find in the Greeks. But if we go to the Charmides, it's really interesting that in the beginning of the Charmides, when Socrates is discussing with Charmides about what is moderation, he says to Charmides, if you are moderate, as Critias says you are, just look into yourself and tell me what you see, because then you're going to perceive what moderation are, and is going to serve for us as a good definition to start the discussion. But of course, the exercise is not successful when they go on to a more Elenchic discussion to find out what it is moderation, and they do not follow this so-called introspective perspective. But yeah, I guess that's what I want to say about that. And the question about the harmony, that of course a lot in the Gorgias, you are totally sure. In fact, my research and my interest in this harmony of the soul, or this unity of the soul, or this consistency and coherence, of the soul. It started in the Gorgias because it's really strong there. That yeah, so the life seems to be the whole discussion seems to be to find out better stable souls, and even the passage that Cecilia quoted earlier, that philosophy says always the same about the same things, is its a statement of this is so harmonic that there is no contradiction, and it's always telling the same, because of course the truth is only one. So it is that aspect, and it's really interesting. So jumping for the Alcibiades is really interesting, because in the way he persuades Alcibiades see that in fact he does not know about justice is when he makes questions, and Alcibiades provides questions that are self-contradictory, and then when he does this publicly, he realizes that he does not know, because had he known, he wouldn't provide such oscillating answers to the same questions. And yeah, so picking up this question of the harmony of the soul, I jumped to also to Rogério's question, and yeah, so you notice that yeah, in the Stoics there is this hegemonic part of the soul, all this sort of soul, which is of course pretty much like the selection of the soul in the Phaedrus and in the Republic. All these solutions, they try to answer for this fragmentation of the self, or not the self, but of the human agent of or human soul, by providing a structure, hierarchized structure, so that you can find harmony in an easier way. And of course, it is a more sophisticated or refined model, because it has a hierarchy, and then you can argue for the rule of the reason. But what I find it interesting is to analyze this less examined notion of the piecemeal harmony that seems to appear in the dialogues, in the so-called Socratic dialogues, in which there is no reflection about the structure of the soul. And of course, as a model, it's a minimal model, it's not a system, so it's rougher, it's less complicated. But since the fragmentation that we experience doesn't seem to fit these compartments that the partitioned models seems to assume, for me, I have the feeling that it's more worth to explore this minimal fragmentary model in order to make sense of human behavior. And there are some contemporary philosophers that follow that. Schwitzgebel has a very nice reflection about this minimal fragmentation of the human mind, and it's yeah, I can send it to you afterwards.
Obrigada, Celso. Ok, terminou? Muito obrigada. Yeah. Então, passo agora para o Consta e depois para a Silvana. David, please.
Thank you both. I have a very brief comment for Alessandro, and then a very quick question for Celso. Alessandro, I just don't know if you've come across, to me it's always striking, the passage in Epictetus, where he says that Socrates was said never to write anything, but that's completely untrue. He was always writing whenever he didn't have someone to talk to. So he constructed dialogues, but he did them in writing. I don't know where Epictetus got this information, or he made it up, but it might be a reference to add to your discussions of the Socrates, the writer. And then for Celso, this is the question: have you looked at all at the current philosophical anthropological tendency to talk about distributed cognition? That is the idea that when we think, we are using our bodies, even an apparatus, so that someone who is using a calculator or a blackboard is actually thinking with that apparatus, and we can think with others. And reason I bring it up is that I've taken seriously Aristotle's claim that a friend is another self. Now, we treat that as a metaphor, only as a metaphor, or friends are one soul in two bodies. But perhaps Aristotle wasn't meaning it as a metaphor. It isn't something that anyone would say today in a serious way. Friends are one mind in two bodies. That friend is me. And that might have some bearing, I don't know what, on the argument about identifying the way the Greeks think of self.
Yeah.
Questions finished.
No, yeah. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, you two very, very interesting points. And yeah, concerning so here at the RUB, there is a really strong point, a strong group of research, and what it is the same that you mentioned, but here they call it situated cognition. So it's this considering all the aspects of cognition, the extended mind, the inactive of mind, and the fact that circumstances and the temperature and whatever, everything, it's part of our decisions, and they try to do, I don't know, it's some sort of empirical philosophy. They do neural research on neurology of people making decisions to understand this cognition. And yeah, I'm delighted to I don't know, at least announce that we are planning to do an event on self-knowledge, on ancient philosophy, and on the situated cognition. And this, so I'm starting this work because I want to integrate in this dialogue. So yeah, you spotted it right away. So thank you for that.
Great.
And
thank you both for your comments. Excellent talks that I enjoyed so much.
Thank you. Now, Silvana, please.
Thank you, Cecilia. Hello to everybody. It's fantastic to be able to see you all. I also have a comment on Alessandro's talk, as it provides me with a perfect introduction for what I will say tomorrow. It is written, it is not unwritten, but I have not sent it to you yet. I will send it to you the soonest possible. Anyway, well, I will take upon Michael's comment on Alessandro when it comes to the word mythologein, and I will add something which may clarify this idea of mythologein in the context of the Republic, in the second book, where Plato coins for the first time the term theologia as opposed to mythologia. So in order to correct mythologia of the epic poets, he comes up with a new notion of mythologia according to some, he uses the word typoi, according to some rules, let's say, and which filter somehow what one is supposed to say about gods and what one is not supposed to say about gods. And I believe that in the symposium we have an illustration of this kind of theologia. When it comes to Euripides, what I will try to illustrate tomorrow is that Socrates is indeed very indebted to Euripides, especially when it comes to the symposium. But let us wait till tomorrow for that. Now, when it comes to the distinction between a poet composing myths and the poet composing verses and using meters. Then we have another suggestion in the Republic again, if I am correct, where Socrates is an admirer of Solon because he came up with metra. Well, the word metra in that context may refer to a well-known verse by Solon, Himertes Sophias metra epistamenos, which means that he knew the measures of the desirable wisdom, Himertes Sophias, and this also suggests that he was a very good lawmaker. So the idea of metra refers both to the measures, the legal measures, and to the poetic metric qualities. And then we have another passage. Where is that? Is it in the Statesman? Where Plato says that the city itself is the best drama one can compose. So in some sense, there is an association between Socrates' poetic performance, let's say, and his political and the political implications of such a drama. And if we go back to what Michael suggested about the idea of homonoia as opposed to pale, I will oppose the term homonoia to another one, to the term symploke that he uses in the Sophist and in other dialogues, because symploke is also a word which has to do with a dramatic play. The ploquet and the symploque of the characters in a plot. The ploquet is the plot. Okay, I think I said enough. I gave enough elements, enough food for thought. So I don't know if Alessandro and Michael would like to respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvana. Please.
Silvana, thank you so much. I think this is very interesting what you said. For one reason, I was thinking of another issue, because if we think of Plato, Plato also was versed in composing verses, because he composed tragedies in his youth, as every one of you knows. And then he decided not to do so and to begin writing philosophy when he met Socrates. So if Plato quits verses and versification at some point of his life, maybe in his youth, when he meets Socrates, and then goes on to another form of poetry, which is philosophical poetry, philosophical myths, Socrates does the opposite, because he knows how to compose poetries, how to do versification, but he does so only in the very last days of his life. So I think we have the opposite course. I mean, Plato goes from versification to philosophical poetry. Socrates moves from elenchus to versification in his very last days. So maybe we have this kind of opposite approaches to the same subject. Of course, Plato is a huge poet and not only a huge philosopher. So I completely agree with you.
Maicon, Celso?
Michael?
Oh, I agree as well. I think that Alessandro has said it. If the problem is to admit that Plato is a poet. If we do so, then we will have these elements and we'll see Socrates, which is his mouthpiece, as a poet as well. So I didn't know that Alessandro also endorsed this opinion, but since he does, and the passage you mentioned about the drama, I think that we can also say about the whole dialogues, because Aristotle at the beginning of the Poetics, he says that the Socraticoi logoi was mimesis. We normally take that to be Plato's dialogues and also the other writings of other Socratics, but I don't know, maybe logoi there is only referring to the speeches of Socrates. Yeah, when Plato compares Socrates, when Plato says that Socrates is a poet, he says that in the Ion, it seems that he presents Socrates as a poet in the Ion. Then afterwards in the Symposium, in Alcibiades' speech, he says that even if you mention one of Socrates' words, if you mention Socrates' speech, you can still feel the enthusiasm that Socrates provokes when he's talking. That means Ion's magnet analogy. He's saying that the magnet analogy works for Socrates. So I think that we can see the whole dialogues and also in this political sense that you emphasized. So I agree.
And also, I'm sorry about that, but if we want to combine Nietzsche with everything we said in order to bring all the authors about, I think that the idea, what you just said about the Symposium and Alcibiades, and the comparison between Socrates and Marsyas playing the flute also gives another stretch to what kind of poetry or music Socrates composed. I mean, was he an adept of Apollo or was he more of an adept of Dionysus? Are they supposed to be one? If the one who can compose a tragedy is also able to compose a comedy, and is then philosophy a combination of both, in the sense of the combination of the spirit of both gods in Nietzschean terms?
Well, thank you, Silvana. I will take you second you because I have raised my hand just to ask this to Alessandro Meni, how we could read in the Phaedon, Meni 60E, when Socrates said about the music that in dreams the dreams urge him to compose. And if this reference to music, and then he said that music, philosophy is perhaps the highest music, you could think this related to harmony and the harmony of soul, etc. But could this be also perhaps a relation to music, thinking in the music of the poetry of the, or music mainly for Euripides, when you think how much Euripides changed the music and in tragedy, and how Euripides' verse, as was put this afternoon by Professor Ordep, how is so musical the text by Euripides. It's just a curiosity if you could read this as also a kind of other reference to a connection between Euripides and Socrates. I know it's very, perhaps it's too much, but it's just something that came to my mind. And when Constant said about the other, I was thinking in Alcibiades, in the moment in, this is to Celso, how important is the moment when Socrates says to Alcibiades, we know each other only when you see ourselves in the eyes, not in the eyes, but in the core, in the pupilla of the other. And it's curious even how this was used many centuries later by Theodoros Angelopoulos in this film, Le Regard d'Ulysse, Tu Vlema tu Odisseia. He used this sentence by Alcibiades, but use the camera, the camera to show this. We can see ourselves only when you see ourselves in the other one. It's just I'm second Dave in this comment. Anyway, if you could briefly comment, thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. Actually, I was looking at the passage just to give a proper answer to your question. As I see this passage, my idea is that Plato is here trying to distinguish. I mean, it's a very rare cases where Plato tries to distinguish between himself and Socrates, because when he says the highest art of philosophy, the highest art is philosophy in the first part of the argument, which is what Socrates was doing his whole life, Plato is referring very much to what his own philosophy and his own writing is. Whereas the second part, when he says that Socrates then composes poetry, he is distinguishing Socrates from Plato himself, from himself. And Socrates will then go on to versify even Aesop, which is not a very original thing to do, admittedly. So I think even Plato here is trying to say, to minimize, Socrates' talent as a poet, and to put his own talent as a philosophical poet in the foreground. So I think there are some passages where you see this, that Plato is distancing himself from his master Socrates by playing down the achievements of Socrates, and saying that Socrates was a poet because he versified Aesop is not a great achievement.
Okay.
I think it's not a very original way of being a poet, or to compose a hymn to Apollon. Everyone was composing hymn to Apollon in Greece. I mean, even, it was not a very special thing to do. So I see here kind of Plato is distancing himself from Socrates, saying that Socrates wrote all the tragedies of Euripides is a great achievement. So Plato is not admitting that in this passage. I wouldn't say that Plato is hinting here at the association, the friendship Socrates-Euripides, because this would give to Socrates a great merit. And I think in this passage, Plato does not want to do this. He wants to do the opposite. He wants to say, Socrates is not such an original poet. I am the true one who is the true poet, because I'm doing philosophy, which is the true kind of musicaire.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, so yeah, this analogy is really really interesting, and so yeah, he uses the problem. He starts to say, okay, let's think about what is know thyself. Let's think if the saying was see thyself, what would imply? And an eye cannot see itself. If it should see itself, it wouldn't be able to see. So it is this problem, the same problem that he deals in the Charmides, or the problem of self-reflexivity. If something to see, you have to see something. If you see yourself seeing, is a sign that you're not seeing anything. So it's a paradoxical problem. And he uses this analogy to think about the case of the soul and thinking, which is pretty, and of course, the purple, the correspondence is to the thinking part of the soul. So you should think the soul thinking. But what I find it really interesting is that sometimes we don't pay attention to this analogy. It's that it's not so easy to agree that it is a good analogy, because at least for if we think, it's easier to accept that we can think while we are thinking, and so we can have second order thinking, right? That you can think about our thinking, and that's why I think that the reflection on the Charmides, it's presupposed for this analogy to occur, because without the refutation of the reflexivity of thinking that occurs in the Charmides, I guess that the analogy doesn't make that much sense. So yeah, but it's really interesting that you have to look at the best part of whatever you want to understand.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We are 22 minutes ahead of the hour we planned to finish. So thank you for your patience. But many thank you for your lectures, Alessandro, Celso, and Maicon, your comments, and the presence of all the questions. And I hope to see you tomorrow in our last day. We start in the morning with Euripides Theater at 11. And the last session will be with Silvana and Constant, who were here today. And so I hope to see you tomorrow. Have a good evening. And thank you again. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Obrigado, pessoal. Tchau, tchau.
Obrigada.